let me begin by giving full thanks to the organizers of this seminar, especially to Polly Stoker for allowing me to share with you part of my research over the past few years. In fact, is some of my earliest research on burlesque and classical burlesque related with the figure of Cassandra, which I've been able to revisit with another lens. Well, I'm not, as you might know, I'm not classicist. I work on classical reception studies from a department of English and German from the perspective of a person of English studies. So my first interest when I studied classical reception studies was in finding and understanding patterns of representations which could link the cultures of the modern world from the classics to the present. Indeed, obviously, this is by no means an innovative research objective at all. Even it has allowed me to learn patterns of representation of women, which are, I believe, still contemporary, and I hope that I might be able to prove that today. Specifically in what I may refer to as the semiosis or the semiotics of burlesque, which I think it's, I read as a semiotic dialogue between the verbal and the visual, which underscores Victorian burlesque as a reflecting and refracting mirror of the contemporary mindset. So for this talk specifically, I was asked to ponder on various topics, ideas, from which I have selected 3. And well, these are basically the questions were proposed to me by Polly. So first of all, the critical potential of the comic in the reception of non-comic classical literature and culture. Second question, how movements for social and political justice testify to mixed relationships with comedy and humor, with the comic mode having served both as a tool of resistance and as a means of exclusion. And number 3, what does evidence of the comic in classical reception tells us about the position of the classical past in the modern world? So with these 3 ideas in mind, I propose to revise one of such patterns that has been a constant in my research from my beginning as a doctoral student, the representation of women and truth in the 19th century. Therefore, I proposed, as I said before, to talk or to speak about the Cassandra myth in Victorian comic refigurations and their aftermath in a post-truth era. In pursuit of the comic Cassandra in the 19th century, I start with Jauset's concept of origin of expectations and consider various contexts for the construction of the meaning. Now, I'm not saying the myth, I'm saying the meaning of Cassandra. So before I delve into the topic of my talk, I will start by defining what I mean by truth. And for my talk today, I'm not going to rely on any philosophical perception of truth, which would, I think, take the whole of the seminar serious, perhaps, but on the linguistic definition of truth, which is provided by the Oxford English Dictionary. So the Oxford English Dictionary lists as many as 13 meanings of the word truth as a noun and an adverb, with 10 specific uses in phrases and 4 general meanings when used in compounds. From these long lists of meanings, I've selected the following, which you've got in your screen. 2.5a, true statement, report or account, which is in accordance with fact or reality, chiefly in to tell, speak, say the truth, to speak truth, to report the matter as it really is. 2.7a, with the fact or facts, the actual state of the case, the matter, situation, or circumstance as it really is. And 3.10a, conformity with fact, reality, a standard, a pattern, etc. Conformity with fact, agreement with reality, accuracy or correctness in a statement or thought. The word is also used in the following compounds, which I have selected again from the registers in the Oxford English Dictionary. Truth speaker as a noun, and I've highlighted the last example with that, which I think is very interesting for a talk today. The truth speaker knows the truth and is trying to give it to us. And also the truth teller, from which I have highlighted again the most recent use, which is recorded at the OD. Those in power need such fact robbers and truth tellers too. I start my talk with a definition of truth because it is intrinsically related, obviously, to the figure of Cassandra. You as classicists and researchers on classical reception studies and well-read in intellectual sectors of society know who Cassandra was and what she represents. But how has the meaning of the word Cassandra, how has she been transposed, translated, and received by the general public? To answer this question, I rely again on the Oxford English Dictionary, on the OED's record, not of the myth, but of the words. And as a noun, the dictionary registers how it has also been used elusively, attributively, and in other combinations. And I have highlighted some examples, and most of them, if not all, or in most of all the examples selected, they provide an example of the pejorative use of a noun. This happens the same, or it happens the same with the derivatives of a noun, Cassandra, like in Cassandrian. After clarifying the terms of keywords with which I'm going to start my talk, let me pose to you 3 questions which underline my revision of the Cassandra myth in the 19th century as I aim to present it today. How are the visual and verbal signs associated with the Cassandra myth interpreted through humor? How do they speak to the idea of truth as related to the woman question in the 19th century? Are they perpetuated or revisioned in both in an era of post-truth? At a time when women's access to knowledge was being disputed, the Cassandra myth provided fertile soil to test and contest the role of women in society. Through the long 18th century, when new prominence was accorded in theatre to the visual of the verbal, epic Cassandra makes regular appearance on the stage. During this period, there was, now quoting here from Edith Hall, public penchant for scenes involving delirious pagan prophetess, which in turn launched the careers of a number of actresses and dancers who found in Cassandra the perfect vehicle to demonstrate their skills. The visual and verbal signs which are recurring in the 19th century refigurations of the Cassandra myth are the open mouth, the rolling eyes, wringing hands, and disheveled hair, with which pictorial representations of the myth are deluged. And I'm going to show to you some of these pictorial representations, which are commonplaces now in the study of the reception of the Cassandra myth in the 19th century. But just to give you an overview of the kind of images that I'm referring to. For example, here you've got Lady Hamilton as Cassandra by George Roney of the late 18th century, with open mouth, rolling eyes, disheveled hair. Similar representation with Henry Fuseli's Cassandra raving, not so much with the hair, but with the facial figures as well. You've got here this illustration, which is accompanied by Dante Gabriel Rossetti's sonnets and Cassandra. And well, for those who have not yet been lucky enough to go to the Rossetti's exhibition at the Tate Gallery, you've got a chance. I think it's still on, and if not, it's a pity because you've got a chance to see these at the exhibition nowadays with a set of other very beautiful pre-Raphaelite paintings. And again, in here, you've got the disheveled hair, the rolling eyes, and the open mouth of Cassandra. Similar representation in Edward Coley Burne-Jones in The Head of Cassandra. And this is one of my favorites, Cassandra by Frederick Sandys, which is in the Ulster Museum, and it was painted around the 1860s. And what I'm most interested in this painting is not only the representation of the Cassandra myth, but also that the model for the painting, it is said that it was a gypsy model, the name of whom was Kaomi. We've got a second version of the Cassandra myth by Frederick Sandys, and this was much later in the century. It is said that for this painting, it might be either the gypsy Kaomi or his daughter, but again, I think it's one of the most illustrative representations, or visual representations of the myth throughout the 19th century. And last but not least, this is Evelyn de Morgan's Cassandra in the late 19th century. And this is one of the first paintings, so the few paintings which we've got in the 19th century, in which you've got the city of Troy and the horse in the backdrop, just together with the representation of Cassandra. Now, these visual depictions of the Cassandra myth are usually put together with epithets related with peripheral characters of the popular culture, as we will see, such as mesmerists and even witches, in translations from the classics throughout the period. Now, the most illustrative translations from the classics in this sense are from Aeschylus's Agamemnon, which I very briefly summarize here in the years which cover the plays that I'm going to be referring to in my talk. So I need to apologize here because I think there's been a problem with the font type in my computer now. Well, these refer to specific moments of Aeschylus's Agamemnon, and the word Pseudomantes, translated as a false prophet, and Photius, roaming widely about maddening. These specific words have been translated in from the 1820s to the 1860s, throughout the 19th century, throughout this very first half of the 19th century, as strolling fortune teller, as a poor minstrel, as a lying witch, wandering gypsy, wandering witch, strolling witch, and a juggler. Now, how do these signs get to the comic stages of the 19th century? In order to answer this question, I examine today first various versions of the epic Cassandra for the stage. But just to give you some hints of what you're going to be seeing, just let me point to this illustration, which was published at the Boys magazine in 1891. And this is an illustration of a gypsy woman kidnapping a baby. And I think I do not need to point to the similarities between the two images here. Now, for my talk today, as I said before, I first examined various versions of Epic Cassandra for the stage. More specifically, the question refigurations of the Siege of Troy in Britain, which adds a further orientalized perspective to the mainstream Cassandra, where she's both the feared sorceress and the mysterious and clairvoyant and exotic gypsy. All these case studies demonstrate how Epic Cassandra demands gestural performance and entails costume and social cultural reference that develop new cultural, intertheatrical, and semiotic systems that problematize and intervene directly in the urgent question of women's knowledge, and in this case, in its representation through humor. Spectacular dramatizations of the Siege of Troy had been at the center of elite entertainments of centuries. Yet from the late 18th century on, London's popular theatre was especially well acquainted with the epic heroes and of the Siege of Troy. It was Sulcana Sittel's role, the Siege of Troy, above all, put on by Mrs. Min's booth at Bartholomew and Southwark fairs, that made these episodes so widely known in Britain. And you can see Mrs. Min at the very center of the image, and at the back, her booth where the Siege of Troy would be represented. In 1795, The Siege of Troy by Joan O'Keeffe, a free pantomimic adaptation of Settl's spectacle, was put on at the new Amphitheatre of Arts in Westminster under the direction of Philip Astley. O'Keefe's stage was the last piece of an evening entertainment where equestrian exercises and races were intermingled with short ballet pieces and pantomimes. The coexistence of O'Keefe's pantomime, which reproduced the most spectacular scenes in Settle, with Astley's equestrian exhibition, paved the way for the staging of the Siege of Troy as a military and classical hippodrama in the 19th century. Indeed, following this 1795 production, almost every manager who took on the running of Astley's amphitheatre left his own imprint on its stage and circus with a revival of the Siege of Troy. As you can see on the screen, in 1833, Andrew de Croo put on the most spectacular adaptation of the giant horse of the Siege of Troy, and in 1854, John Robert O'Neill, known as Hugo Vam, put on the Siege of Troy or the Misjudgment of Paris under William Cook's management. Penned by John Amherst, de Croo's production remodeled the stage and circus arena by filling it with water and laying on, as promised in the playbill, I'll quote, 220 artists and 45 trained horses, unquote. Rather than conscious reworkings of classical texts, the equestrian spectacles based on classical epic Astleys aimed at promoting a flourishing new form of entertainment. Consequently, the repertoire of the circus was developed with an eye to the box office and not to the fidelity to the classics. As a critic of a new monthly magazine and humorist puts it, what do the unwashed frequenters of Astley's know about the gods of the Greek mythology or the demigods of the heroic ages, and yet see the enthusiastic sympathy with which they hailed their effigies as offered to them by the genius of de Croo. As you probably know, also sketches by Box and Hard Times by Charles Dickens and Jane Austen's Emma refer to these performances at Astley's. Even if dramatic license prevailed over accuracy, the classical interactions that emerged in the process of turning epic into equestrian burlesque paradoxically brought the classical heroes closer to 19th century audiences. These plots juxtaposed images from the classical past with the 19th century social imaginary in a hybrid semiotic system that linked the past and the present. There were also private theatricals, ballets, puppet shows, and classical non-equestrian burlesques whose scripts have not been preserved based on the Siege of Troy. The recurrence of these images during a course between variation and tradition reflected the ritualization of the Siege of Troy as a national entertainment and built up an archive of expectations that prompted the mythologization of the theatrical event. Whether at King's Theatre, Cremont Gardens, or at Astley's, whether as a ballet, a marionette show, or an equestrian performance, attending a dramatization of the events in Troy in the 19th century meant participating in a cultural event that became, after Settle, nearly, I would say, as quintessentially British as the Christmas pantomime is at present. The reverberation of parallel images in the various venues meant in recursive terms, realizing anew, recalling, replying to, retorting, even revoking heritages from both the classical and the national pasts. The new ludicrous form of epic which was dominating the arena at Astley's, therefore, became a cultural site wherein to test and contest images of national mythologies and archetypes. If we consider Astley's arena a site where social female archetypes were either legitimized or disputed, with strong-minded masculine women coexisting with female acrobats, the choice of female characters in 19th century dramatizations of the Siege of Troy was primarily motivated by a single main concern: the exhibition of a cultural semiotic system with female models easily recognizable and appealing to audiences. Not surprisingly, therefore, Cassandra, who easily melded with current debates on women's access to knowledge, is a recurring pillar in these performances. Before going into analyzing a little bit more the performances of the Siege of Troy at Astley's Amphitheatre, I wanted to show to you some images of the stage, of the venue, because, well, I did not know the background of the audiences that we would be having in this seminar. So, well, if you're acquainted with Astley's Amphitheatre, I hope that you enjoyed them. And if not, well, I hope that I can give you a glimpse of what you could see there. So this is Astley's Amphitheatre at the very beginning of the 19th century, in which only the arena or the area of the arena is being used. And you can, as you can see at the back of the arena, you've got the orchestra. On occasions, it was not only the arena, as you can see here, but also the main stage, which was being used for spoken drama, and even for the representation of certain battle scenes, as you might see not in this illustration, but in the following, in which you can see the battle scenes being represented both in the arena and in the main stage. Now, the figure of Cassandra, the prophetess, is revived in every restaging of the Siege of Troy at Astley's. In all of them, the equestrian appropriation of the Trojan princess perpetuates the fusion of the epic and the tragic Cassandra, combined with other dramatic popular figures, such as orientalized seers and chromatic clairvoyants, as I said before. Okay, there we are. O'Keeffe's 1795 Siege follows the 18th century theatrical premise that the action must speak to the eye and is therefore in line with the pantomimic attitudes of Hamilton and Handel shoots by the 18th century, which reproduced the figure of Cassandra. O'Keeffe claimed to display, and I quote, the most lively and interesting picture of the various passions that agitated the human breast, which it is possible to convey through the medium of scenic effect, unquote. Therefore, even though no lines are given to Cassandra in the pantomime, the epithets that define her as a lunatic with a deranged mind point to a performance style that once again highlights the inherent theatricality of the myth. The emphatically gestural portrayal of Cassandra here will be carried forward in subsequent stages at Astley's. Andrew de Croo had taken on the management of the theatre in 1824, and in 1833 he staged John Ams's The Giant Horse, or The Siege of Troy, as I said before, which was eulogized by the press for its spectacular staging. The playbill advertising the performance provides substantial evidence of the magnificence of the spectacle, with an illustration of a colossal horse, flanked by full description of the procession of, and I'll quote, 45 highly trained steeds of different nations, unquote, and a stud of wild zebras and a troop of fairy ponies, unquote. Such grandiose staging was not only possible because of the venue, but also due to the conventions set by Philip Astley's popularization of the Trojan episode through his revisitings of the Planocitel's text. Reviews of de Croo's show point to the audience's intimate acquaintance with the subject, particularly amongst the younger members in the amphitheatre. The reviewer of the Dublin Evening Paketon correspondent, for example, argued how the plot is familiar to every schoolboy and the story, in this reading age, to the great majority of children of a river age. Indeed, Greek epic was part of the curricula of the elite schools in England, but the Giant Horse had also been adopted for the juvenile drama in Orlando Hodgson's celebrated series. With a colourful set and plates, the reproduction of the hippodrama in miniature by Hodgson testifies to the success of the show, which was eventually transferred to Drury Lane with new seasons and numbers. The playbills show Miss Enscoe, who was an actress at Astley's stock company between the 1820s and the 1830s, billed as Cassandra. Miss Enscoe had made a name for herself, playing exotic, enigmatic parts in ballettes and pantomimes. She was therefore ideally cast for Amherst's Cassandra, if we take Hodgson's juvenile adaptation as a close aesthetic version of the production at Astley's. In Hodgson's story adaptations of The Giant Horse, there is neither a speaking Cassandra nor a single allusion to the character. Still, a frenzied Cassandra is portrayed facing the giant horse, wild and impulsive, with a torch in her hands in the backdrop for Acts 2, scenes 4 and 7. Hodson's illustration reinforces the epic Cassandra's aesthetic function in the amphitheatre, namely to prepare the spectator both for the epilepsies, the astonishment at the spectacular entrance of the giant horse, and for an increase in the pathos of the scene. And let me show to you some of the original illustrations for Hodson's both characters and toy play, which I think will give you a better idea of what I'm speaking about. Okay, this is Ducrot in his performances at Astley's Amphitheatre, and there we are. These are the original drawings for the backdrop for the toy versions of this Siege of Troy. This is another drawing for another backdrop. And these are some pieces of scenery for the toy theatre. And these are some of the characters. And in here, there is the figure which I was talking to you about, dressed in blue, just at the very front of the image. Moreover, the illustrations of the characters in the plays are not only this illustration, but also these illustrations that you find in this slide, collected in Hodson's characters in 1833, include a subsidiary female figure who adds further semiotic intertheatricalities to Hodson's approach to the Georgian prophetess. The playbill for Astley's production describes a stylized procession in the arena with a sorcerer, maidens, vestals, chariots of oxen, slaves, and Egyptian mummies that display the whole gamut of theatrical resources. In Hodson's characters, the sorceress is drawn as a frenzied woman with a prophetic tablet in her hands and Kabbalistic signs trimmed on her costume, with an embroidered inscription purposely misspelling Greek characters. The visual prominence of the sorceress here, in contrast, and I think that you can see her better in here, in contrast with other silent characters in their procession, serves to highlight the visual dimension of clairvoyance both at Astley's and at Hodson's. This is comparable to the warriors and horses and the trophy of arms, which emphasize the military spirit of the performance through the same procession. Considering together both Cassandra and the sorceress, near semiotic connections come into play that associate the epic figure with on-stage gypsies and popular refigurations of Cassandra elsewhere in the 19th century. In this instance, the constellation of meanings transmitted through costume and props, the tablet, the elaborate outfit, provides specific information on the role, which relates the two characters to enigmatic clairvoyance. These paratextual elements allow us to read the comic image of Cassandra as a Kabbalistic, gypsified sorceress, and sometimes even so hysterical, because she says the same cliches. So, for example, the elaborate petticoats worked at the bottom with black Kabbalistic signs is a marker of clairvoyance gypsies, as acknowledged by a critic in the penny illustrated paper, and later in the century by Edmond de Goncourt in his acclaimed portrait of circus life, in which he claims how the Bohemian Romani was clad with, I quote, some Kabbalistic signs printed on her costume. The last recorded equestrian burlesque of the Siege of Troy staged at Astley's is John Robert O'Neill's The Siege of Troy, or The Misjudgment of Paris. O'Neill's siege was first performed in August 1854, just before the Allied forces, France, Britain, and the Ottoman Empire and Sardinia, which fought against the Russian Empire, landed in Sevastopol during the Crimean War. References to the conflict abound in the play. Many of them are interspersed as satiric puns in Cassandra's visions of the Trojan War. Cassandra, as a political commentator, as a truth speaker or truth teller, was a commonplace in Victorian England, with Florence Nightingale's essay Cassandra, first published or printed privately in 1852, and William Ruthven Rex walks ahead of the warnings of Cassandra 1874 as two of the most flagrant examples. Besides demonstrating her engagement in politics, O'Neill's Cassandra extends the tradition of the theatrical Cassandra into highly visual scenes, which became hallmarks of Cook's management. First, she provides the action to the ecstatic series of Tableau, which represents the judgment of Paris in 1-1, when she interrupts the freeze frames, entering and running like winking, waving her torch as a mass prophetess mesmerized by Apollo. Then she comes on stage widely with the unheeded prophecies in Act 2, anticipating against the audience's plexus when the horse is dragged across the stage. Among the various popular cliches on which O'Neill draws, there is mesmerism, which was widespread and extensively practiced in England from the 1830s well until the end of the century by people from different backgrounds and interests. Itinerant lecturers talked about the medical powers of such pseudoscience and dramatized its effects, following a predictable pattern that paralleled Cassandra enthusiasms. It is no coincidence, therefore, that in 1843, a certain Madame Dolce performed the part of clairvoyant somnambulist in Lestats by Lockroy and Arnold, like another Cassandra, in London. And then in her mesmeric shows in Baker Street, Madame Tegmont was built in 1844 as the Sleeping Cassandra. The general scheme was that a male Apollonian mastermind accepted his mesmeric powers over one or several women. The alleged effects on the mesmerized ladies or ladies in question were new mental and sensory powers, including second sight and the physical ecstasies that O'Neill seeks to recreate in his show. As Lisa questioned Cassandra then, presented a set of prescriptive images by means of which the epic prophetess was aligned with contemporary seers. By the mid-19th century, the comic city of Troy had essentially become a product of Astley's. However, neither the episode nor the association between Cassandra and peripheral social characters such as mesmerizers, clairvoyants, and gypsies was exclusive to Astley's hyperdrama. And you've got here some other representations of the episode in some other genres, which I do not have the time to deal with today. Yes, and in the midst of the 19th century first feminist turmoil, Robert Rees takes a step forward and resets the Cassandra myth into contemporary perceptions of women and knowledge in Agamemnon and Cassandra, or the Prophet of and Loss of Troy, first performed this time not at Astley's Amphitheatre but at Liverpool's Prince of Wales's in 1868. Robert Rees's play is the first English play, to my knowledge, where the burlesque Cassandra is depicted as a round character. The performance was widely acclaimed and reviewed both in the local and national press of the time, mostly because of the acting of Harry Beckett. I will not read the reviews for reasons of time, but I mean you can see the highlighted words in them. Every ingredient of classical burlesque was present in the play. Richard's roles interpreted by popular beauties, word puns, grand transformation scenes, stage effects, and famous burlesque performers. The play was groundbreaking in showcasing Cassandra as an ungovernable slave princess whose words were heeded by the court in Argos. The literary sources of the play ranged from Aeschylus, Seneca, and Shakespeare to English folk songs, Celtic mythology, and French theatre. None of them, however, provide in isolation a whole satisfactory response to the quest for the social cultural factors which endorse his Cassandra, which is only fully understood when read with its popular reference. And I've selected a few passages of the play, which again I'm not going to be reading, but you can see the highlighted words in them and establish the connections between these popular characters and the figure of Cassandra. She's got this prompt appearance as the champagne boat with the boat's recent dress. She's smart. You can see that with her hair and the dress. She's related to witches in here, again with word puns. And she's connected with seers and astrologers of the time. Considering other aspects which evidence the ambiguity of burlesque, such as Cassandra's active participation as a political truth teller or truth speaker in the unmasking of the regicide and the subsequent consideration of her voice, Cassandra becomes, and this is just by the end of the play, so I would argue that she becomes a model for intellectual voices of women of the 19th century, which are scorned by the patriarchal power, yet nonetheless have an active political voice. And this you can see, and this line is only included in the manuscript, not in the final printed version of the play, but we do not know which one was actually performed on the stage. And this is the only time in the burlesque plays that I have studied in which you can see the Cassandra myth depicted, in which Cassandra's sense for once has found a tongue. Now, let me recap the main ideas of my arguments presented so far. The various comic refigurations of the Cassandra myth are informed by a rich amalgam of sources, which include Shakespeare, as well as Greek and Roman texts. And they are united by a semiosis of theatrical patterns. And down to the 1860s, they all respond to a rich iconographic tradition as well as a textual tradition that privileges spectacle over the original references. Now, if you remember, I proposed to start my talk with a definition of truth. The comic refiguration of the Cassandra myth in Victorian classical and equestrian burlesque evidence a truism that when truth is inconvenient to the reigning power structures, the best possible solution is to delegitimize the truth teller, the truth speaker, dissociating himself or herself from real politics, and to subordinate his or her discourse either to madness or to peripheral characters and forms of accessing knowledge, such as necromancy, mesmerism, gypsies, witches, and on some occasions in relation to hysteria. So far, I have tried to show to you various cases of study which might provide a satisfactory answer to my first two questions: how the visual and verbal signs associated with the Cassandra myth were interpreted through humor, and how do they speak to the idea of truth as related to the woman question in the 19th century. Now, for my third initial question, though, I'm only going to provide further topics of inquiry. So in order to do this, I will start again with a definition of a main term of discussion, post-truth, as provided by the Oxford English Dictionary. As an adjective, the Oxford English Dictionary included post-truth as occurring after or resulting from a disclosure of the truth with a rare use, and more recently, originally, in relation to the US, relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping political debate or public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Now, when post-truth was added to the Oxford English Dictionary, it was reviewed at the BBC News website as follows. From all the possible images and ideas associated with the notion of truth, of post-truth, I would like you to note the first image selected for this piece of news, and I will come back to this later. To be honest, I need to also, or to be fair, I need also to show to you the second image, which was associated with a piece of news, this piece of news. Now, I'm using this image to illustrate how modern feminism and feminist practices are intimately related with the idea of post-truth and the figure of Cassandra. For these, I'm borrowing Botchen's ideas and her ideas on the increasing presence of feminism in mainstream culture that have granted recognition to to women's experiences, and now quote from Botchen, created a critical knowledge on the basis of gendered experience. Botchen begins the ideas considered considering how, quote again, second-wave feminism authorized the side of women's individual experience as central to the formation of a collective political subject that could transform the gendered social relations of power, unquote. So personal experience provided, now continue quoting, a foundation for the production of knowledge and a point of departure for a critical politics based upon claims to truth about the operation of patriarchal power. Recently, the Me Too movement has generated an exceptional degree of attention and is fundamentally built upon the claims to truth that women have made regarding their experiences, unquote. So in a post-truth era, Burton contends, women's experiences and claims have been contested and delegitimized with statements and whole campaigns of disbelief, which have found their responses in opposite movements, such as the I believe her or I believe you, with contrasting objectives. So the connection of between experience and knowledge has always been a central central problematic in feminist theory. And as Burton argues, and I quote again, feminist epistemology requires a response to the conventions of claims making associated with a post-truth regime of truth, unquote. The conclusion that Burton presents in her article is that, and I quote again, in a context where the legitimacy of feminist approaches to knowledge and of the marginalized experiences they attend to is regularly under attack, the task of feminist theory is to generate critically informed analysis of gendered social relations currently being configured within a post-truth climate. The analysis of women's experience remains then central to that enterprise, unquote. Burton develops her ideas along a very interesting article, which I've tried to summarize here with the purpose of introducing Cassandra again in the discussion. If we focus in the trace of patterns that I proposed at the very beginning of my talk, the links between the figure of Cassandra and the campaigns of discredit initiated against women's experiences, the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter movements, and other movements of empowerment is self-evident. The semiotic system constructed around her visual and verbal representation and the visual and verbal representation of these women is also very similar, if not equivalent. And let me remind you here again of the BBC image for illustrating how the OD had included the word post-truth in the dictionary, and also some other images which I selected from The Guardian and the New York Times, which focus on the agitated passion of the campaigners instead of on the messages of truth. In my arguments, I'm taking the media as equivalent to the popular theatre of the 19th century for its immediacy and its power to mold and represent the public's opinion and imaginary. And for this, I'm going to finish with a specific case of study, which I hope might raise some interesting questions to debate later. In 2019, the personal experience of Serena Williams was used by Nike in a strong campaign, which was aligned with the current trend of authenticating individual gendered experience as an epistemic form of feminism, referred to by Burton. If you want, I will leave the ad at the very end of my talk, so we can follow the arguments here. But I would like you to see later. So these ads, which aimed at the empowerment of the voice of Serena Williams and other sportswomen, was released just as before the Australian Press Council deemed a cartoon depicting Williams's 2008 in Wimbledon, and I'm quoting from the press, tantrum, acceptable. The cartoon was designed by Mark Knight and published at the Herald Sun, and used humor to denigrate Serena Williams's claims, personal experience, and truth, and transformed her character into madness, derangement, and hysteria. Needless to say, the racial connotations of the image, which you can see here. In this particular case, comic appropriations of signs typically related to madness, derangement, and hysteria, and eventually to the figure of a representation of personal experience and truth in the figure of Cassandra, served as a catalyst for silencing and repressing the discourses of truth. Now, at the other end, this same cartoon was again used by the Herald Sun in order to support Mark Knight's cartoon in the front page of a journal, as you can see here. And well, this ignited various comments on some well-known figures, as you've got here, for example, J.K. Rowling leading the comments in Twitter, saying, "Well done on reducing one of the greatest sportswomen alive to racist and sexist tropes and turning a second-rate sportsman," which you can see at the back of the image, Naomi Osaka, into a faceless prop. So at the other end, liminal appropriations of the same signs, and I'm referring to the same signs related with madness, derangement, and hysteria, are being appropriated on the side of contemporary feminism revision as a tool of empowerment. And this is what Elke Krasny refers to as hysteria activism. Following Krasny, hysteria activism, I'll quote, uses the media as platform for global visibility and local issues. It performs subversive, resistant, defiant, satirical, and even militantly violent attacks on patriarchy's attacks. And she analyzes these phenomena via 4 cases of study. And I'm just going to refer to one of these just because of reasons of time. Still, according to Krasny, the 4 institutions that she analyzes make the claim to hysteria to expose the wounds, and I'll quote here, of patriarchy inflicted by patriarchy, unquote. For the limits of my presentations, as I said before, I'm only going to present very cursorily the work of the first association, the one that you've called here, the Association of Hysteric Curators in Los Angeles. The mission of the association is summarized in its website. It says, we seek to explore, and I quote, notions of female protest and the presence of gendered articulations through a non-hierarchical structure based in dialogue and exchange. As we honor the lineage of feminist models, we dare to envision a future of human equality, knowing we must interrogate the customs of today in order to enable conditions for change. And of all the actions that the Association of Hysteric Curators have participated in, I have selected these 2 images, which represent the first one, My Body, My Truth, an exhibition that challenges traditional perceptions of the body of women in reference to its representation in terms of race, for example, or personal experience, which took place in 2021. And the image that you've got at the other side of the screen, which is a photograph by artist Lily Bernard, used by the association to give visibility to the work of contemporary artists and activists. The photograph is entitled Downing and Dismissal of the Conqueror's Coiffure, and it was taken in 2019, and it aims at breaking traditional representations of Black women and frenzied women, hysterical women with cliche gestures, which I think are familiar to us after this hour. Now, at this point, and to finish, I would like to go back to the 3 initial questions with which I began my talk. And I'm going to provide, as I said, if I'm not going to provide answers, so only to leave them open for us, for you, for all of us to discuss in this second part of the session. What is the critical potential of the comic in the reception of non-comic Cassandra literature and culture in relation to the Cassandra myth and the concept of truth? How do movements for social and political justice testify to mixed relationships with comedy and humor, with the comic mode having served both as a tool of resistance and a means of exclusion? And what does evidence of the comic in classical reception tell us about the position of the classical past in the modern world? And finally, perhaps to personal question about how many deranged, frenzied, hysterical Cassandras they speak the truth at present, and are represented with comic figures, you know. Thank you so much.